Okay, so I think we are live now. This panel. Welcome everyone. Welcome to the SHEILA MOOC live panel 1, a systematic adoption of learning analytics in higher education. My name is Yi-Shan. I'm a research associate at the University of Edinburgh. And we have two fantastic panelists with us today. We have Shen Dawson with your hand. Right. So Shen is a professor of learning analytics and director of the Teaching Innovation Unit at the University of South Australia. His research focuses on the use of social network analysis and learner ICT interaction data to inform and benchmark teaching and learning quality. He's a founding executive member of the Society for Learning Analytics Research and past program and conference chair of the International Learning Analytics and Knowledge Conference. And we have Robert coming.
Hello.
Yeah, and we have Robert from Singapore. Robert is the Associate Provost of Education and Director at Duke and US Medical School at National University of Singapore. He's also the founding director of the Institute for the Application of Learning Sciences and Education Technology, ALICT. And ALICT is the educational research unit at the National University of Singapore and has developed the educational data lake to drive data-enhanced learning activities. So we're looking forward to hearing about the experiences of the two great panelists about the institutional adoption of learning analytics and policy development in Singapore and Australia. We initially have a panelist from Torhold, from Norway, but unfortunately he is having some trouble accessing Google Hangout at the moment, so we are not able to have him. And Dragan Gasevich, unfortunately, he's having a very bad cold, so he's probably watching us somewhere, drinking his cough syrup at the same time. So we'll just have Bob and Shen with us, but I'm sure the conversation is gonna be very interesting with you two. So without further delay from my side, I will just go straight in with the questions that we have. And just for our audience, if you are watching us online now, please feel free to post your questions during the panel either on YouTube, or if you are a learner of our MOOC, please feel free to post your question on the course platform as well. And you can also choose to post your question on Twitter by using hashtag SHEILA Project. Right, okay. Now, that's all I have to say. So our first question here for our panelists is there a need for a national or institutional learning analytics specific policy, and why? May I invite Bob to perhaps share with us?
Before I start, maybe I just clarify a little bit about my background. I'm a physician, and I ran an educational program at the medical school here. Before I start, maybe I just clarify a little bit about my background. I'm a physician, and I ran an educational program. I'm getting a lot of feedback here. I'm sorry. Let's try and figure out why that is.
Can you still hear any echo? Is it fine now?
I heard my echo, so let me try again.
Yi-Shan, you might need to mute yourself when Bob's talking.
Okay.
Okay, well, maybe that will help. Okay, thank you. So just to clarify, I was at the medical school, now in the main campus of the National University of Singapore, and we've started a new unit on learning, which is called AllSet. And as part of the strategy for trying to bring in more learning sciences in the university, we thought it should be very data-driven. So our learning analytic group we formed a learning analytic group to really help bring together that strategy for bringing our faculty together. So just to answer your question, I think that one of the things that I've noticed is that there is quite a disparity in how institutions treat privacy issues, their attitudes towards learning analytics, it seems to vary widely from a place even like China, which is very open in terms of and not very much privacy concerns, to maybe the EU or the US, which are very much more concerned about privacy issues. I think in Singapore, we're somewhere in between that. So part of the job of really putting together the learning analytics group here is to, and the policies behind that, is really, as I say, to understand the temperature of our institution and of Singapore in general, and in terms of the tolerance and the comfort with data and analytics towards on the use of analytics on that learning data. I'd also say, just as a general comments to get us started, is that Singapore is very driven towards KPIs, or key performance indicators. And so it's very, I think already coming into this, already very comfortable in terms of how it runs government, how it runs institutions, including higher education institutes, of using data to try to assess and evaluate the higher education. So so I think, in fact, administrators and faculty and students are all and somewhat comfortable in terms of kind of the business type applications of learning analytics and institutional applications. What we haven't been able to do yet is, as we're starting to get into, is these kinds of applications to try to understand more about the learner, and then also to understand more about how our faculty are teaching. So those are areas that that haven't been it hasn't been really used in Singapore at all. But I think overall, I'd say the atmosphere for learning analytics is quite open. And with that respect, I think that our policies and what we can do and what we can't do has to reflect that temperature that is taken, and understanding that from all the stakeholders, from our students to our administrators, is key in taking that temperature. Okay,
Great.
All right.
Sorry, I need to remember to unmute myself. Okay, may I invite Shan to share your thoughts too?
Sure, I'll try and be provocative so that people have got something to talk about during the MOOC. So I'm going to say, I'll directly answer it and say no. And I'll echo Bob's comments there around taking the temperature of in relation to the context of your national programs and how your higher education institution fits within that framework within a country, for instance. So if you're operating in Europe, where I know you're heading, a lot of the attendees for this MOOC are situated, then obviously you've got a lot of privacy and ethics discussions going on at the moment, and then learning analytics and the use of data in that space obviously plays a central role. So therefore, the policy for any learning analytics that's governed by an individual institution needs to reflect that. Now, does it need to be a separate one? I'd say no. I'd say you need a strategy. And so I think there are enough policies around how data is utilized from, I won't go too much into Bob's area, or otherwise I'll look exceedingly foolish in the medical arena. Just even how governments handle, and Bob used the examples of China. I'll go through and say in the Australian context, we have also policies around the use of student data, for instance, that are governed by our accrediting bodies, right, TEXA. So an institution, I think, fits in with that process. I mean, learning analytics is really the use of that data and the application of that data to provide insights into the learning process. How that's fed back, whether it's around aspects that Bob raised in terms of the quality of the education offering and course. I mean, if we would go back 20 years ago, we would have called that institutional performance and quality assurance processes. Now we tend to call it learning analytics. I think, are we providing it to students, and are we providing it to staff, and what boundaries are we crossing, I think is framed within a strategy rather than a policy. So for UniSA, we already have a policy on the regulation and the use of data, and student data in particular. The learning analytics policy, we didn't need an additional policy in that respect. What we needed was a learning analytics strategy which illustrated how we would make use of that data within the constraints of the current policy processes. So I'm going to say no.
And so Shane, also in terms of, you're also important for a process of being able to make decisions.
That's right.
I think that I think all the, what I'm saying, or what we're saying is all the universities who have their own, may have their own, end up with their own policy, but what's important, or policy, but I think what's going to be important is that everyone understands that there's a process, that process is transparent, and people can input into that, and that policy then, that process then develops the policy specific to the institution.
That's correct. So our strategy for learning analytics, for instance, details how so we already, as noted, right, you already have a policy around the use of student data, for example. The learning analytics strategy would meld into the quality assurance of processes associated with that other policy, right? So we have one that's around quality assurance and how we would do accreditation and be accredited by our tertiary education and quality standards group. That there's already a whole framework around what committees, what processes, what data is collected, and so on and so on. The difference in this one is, in terms of learning analytics, is how we extract use of that around, at a finer detail, if you like, around the, my dishwasher just went off, which is awesome for a MOOC. So it's how, exactly right, how we're using that data and articulating that, again, within the framework of that policy. So it does, a lot of the processes and systems are in place. We're just looking now at how we communicate, and I think you used the word transparent in yours, Bob, and I would agree absolutely that the whole process is transparent and clear so that people can have a discussion around that.
So can I just follow up on what you just said there, Shane? So in this policy for the use of student data, is learning analytics mentioned there, and is it defined in the policy for learning analytics?
No, it's not. No, it's not. But our learning analytics strategy does. So, and likewise, likewise, any learning and teaching strategy doesn't define the policy, does it? Right? It operates within it. So, I mean, we don't define digital learning in our policies either. We don't define education technology in our policy. We define things like academic integrity. We define things like quality assurance processes and continuing improvement. We define aspects around what data is collected in the data sharing process, but not how that data is used. So we do have processes in policy around that. Can an academic staff member access, for instance, their course data? And course data then would be all aspects of it, whether that's attendance records for students, if they take that, right, for practical purposes. So if they have or for, let's say, placements where students have to do a certain number of hours on placement, then they may have to record that for accreditation processes. So that data is captured, but we don't say that's learning analytics, right? But we say, okay, but if you wanted to look at it and say, I don't know, how many placement hours is optimal for a student? You could analyze that under the continuous improvement process of a course. If I then wanted to go and say, well, let's do it for every course, am I the owner of it? Then we have a process, which I think what Bob's referring to. We have a process already defined in our other policies about saying, okay, if you want to go beyond your individual course for continuous improvement, here's the process you need to follow. If I wanted to use it for research, here's the process you follow, right, to request those things. Which is why I think, from at least my perspective, and I would say mostly for the Australian institutions, we don't need a learning analytics policy. I think we need a statement around learning analytics. I think we need a learning analytics strategy, but they're different documents and they have served different purposes.
Okay.
Perhaps a further discussion on this is that there's concerns about privacy. It's hard to create a policy around all the privacy issues because, for instance, when we're using our phone and calling a ride hailing service like Uber, we're willing to give up quite a bit of privacy in terms of where we are and where we're going to, because we get a lot of benefit back. And yet, I think that people wouldn't be willing to give up privacy if they're not getting anything back. So it's hard to write a policy that kind of covers all of these contingencies. I think that we would need to have, as I said, back to say a process of determining what are the times when we think it's okay to give up some privacy or allow our learners or faculty to give up some privacy in return for some real benefit that they receive.
Thank you. Well, thank you both for sharing your thoughts. My next question is, what is your observation of learning analytics policy or strategy related to your observation of activities related to the development of learning analytics policy or strategy up to date? Perhaps in your institutions or in your country.
Right. So I think I could speak from the National University of Singapore perspective, in that we're still pretty new in all of this. We're certainly not mature in terms of our policy. We're really still getting it together, and it doesn't happen overnight because as we've talked about, you have to engage all the stakeholders. What's interesting, I find interesting, is that NUS is generally a very hierarchical structure, very top-down. It really has been challenging to get our students involved and get them interested in the whole idea of privacy, and partly just really getting them to understand the concept in general. You know, it's a major issue, not just with learning analytics, but with all sorts of data. And as a physician, as well as an educator, the same sorts of issues that we're trying to get people to be alert about in terms of the medical privacy also holds in terms of the educational privacy. So I think that we're certainly not immature. We're just really still in the process of putting together our statements or our processes around learning analytics. But I'd say so far, really our major task is really to be able to identify all the stakeholders and be able to effectively communicate with them and effectively get information back from them. And I know that that's what's been helpful about the framework that SHEILA has put together in terms of that, and some of the tools that we've borrowed from you, Yi-Shan, thank you very much, and Dragan, in terms of trying to ask questions of our stakeholders and try and make sure that that gets implemented in the processes and policies and strategies that we come up with.
Thank you. Shan, may I invite you to share your thoughts too?
Sure. Yeah, it's an interesting space, right? So I think at the moment, I think there's a lot of movement in the way that learning analytics are being viewed, and it's not consistent across institutions, and they have different drivers for it. And I think that, you know, the first national study that we did in Australia, where SHEILA leveraged from, was all the institutions in Australia. And we, broadly speaking, I mean, pretty much all of them said learning analytics was of a high strategic priority. Right? None of them said we need a policy, right? So they spoke more in terms of strategies, just to tie it back into that space. But they had different drivers. So we had some institutions where clearly, you know, the way that our government funds higher education and the context that we're situated in Australia, you know, things like retention are of importance. You know, Bob raised key performance indicators. That's one of ours, right? It's one of our funding mechanisms. The way we're funded is very heavily contingent on you know, retaining students. So if you can use learning analytics to resolve a particular problem around retention, then it has a direct economic influence, right, into your institution, which means you can invest in more areas. So that makes it a bit easier in terms of articulating why we need learning analytics. And so I think some of the problems that Bob sort of raised there in trying to understand the key stakeholders, if you have a driving problem, it's much easier to commence that discussion, right? Everyone gets on board much faster. If you come from an institution where, let's say, in the Australian context, where things like retention are not an issue, then what's the driver for learning analytics? Like why do we need it? You know, what purpose does it start to serve beyond innovation and playing around? So I think in that context, we saw a number of mechanisms in the way that universities tried to adopt and implement learning analytics from a strategic standpoint, either as an innovation, playful space, or as a solution to a specific problem. Neither of them were overly successful. And I think this is the area in terms of the future of learning analytics where we need to address. We've got a broadening gap we have some exceptional research being undertaken, exceptional, right? The way we're analyzing data with new models, new processes, and multimodal data is going up and up by, in leaps and bounds every LAC conference we attend. It's getting more and more sophisticated. The issue with it is it's becoming more and more fine-grained. And that sharing of data, or the being able to access larger pools of data from an institutional standpoint, doesn't exist. Now, for me, that's a bigger gap, right? The outcomes that you're trying to get in research, then being deployed across an institution, is lacking. And that's a massive problem that we need research in that space. How do we do adoption models should be a priority area for learning analytics going forward. How do you get it implemented in institutions? How do people have sense making of different forms of dashboards and processes? How do they relate and change to not only the learning behavior, but also the teaching behavior? So I think that's, in the context of Uni SA, I'll talk about our institution, that's where we're sitting. And we've adopted a complexity leadership model where we try and enable people who are key experts in certain spaces of learning analytics within our strategy, whether that sits on the technology side, the data analysis side, sense making, teaching, educational design, and so forth. We try and enable people to bring their view to resolve particular problems at that time, and then articulate that across the organisation. So we have people who are very adept at working with the provost and vice chancellor level, but then can articulate the problems that an individual faculty member might see. And I'll give an example of that is when we rolled out our first learning analytics dashboard for our teaching staff. The biggest problem they came back to us was that this has now had a huge impact on workload. Now, the easy thing would be to delete it, because it raised issues around the certain number of students who are not accessing. It's made them more transparent, right? The students who are not accessing their blended learning environment or fully online learning environment, which meant that the staff now have to call, right? You have to intervene, you have to do something. So then we invested in areas around getting them all together and saying, well, what would reduce the workload here? And now we've rolled out a fully automated, personalised and adaptive feedback mechanism. So people create rules rather than change the system. So when we come across a problem or friction in that system, we look to solutions through complexity, like bring the people together, sort through the solution, that build networks that we can leverage and get influence on, to then roll it out across the rest of the organisation. And that's been very successful in our institution, but it does not easily come by, right? It's a different way of thinking about how organisations run, from top down or bottom up or grassroots, or however way you want to do it. It's really an emergence of identifying a problem, bringing the key people in to resolve that problem, and then using networks. Who do we need to influence to get this across the line? And that may mean a revision to a policy. It might mean writing a new policy. I haven't come across that yet, but we've certainly made revisions to policies. We've certainly built new technologies and tools, and we've done a hell of a lot of communication. But they've been the key facets of trying to get the key people in line with the friction and the problem that's addressed through the implementation of a process. I think they're the key. For me, the strategy process, I think people are articulating a need for learning analytics quite well, from that innovation through to addressing a problem. The area it's falling down is the actual implementation and how we roll this across, because it hits, there's nothing in an organisation it doesn't touch on, right? It's all facets of it. So it's complex by its very nature.
No, thank you, Stan. That was very interesting. You actually answered my next question already.
Well, I've got 5 minutes to go, so I thought I'd just combine everything into one.
That's great. That's what we need. I would like to just say to the audience who is watching this live panel now, please feel free to post your questions now. It's left. And if I don't get any question, I'm gonna take the power as a chair to ask the question that I haven't managed to ask, but Shan already magically answered it. So I will direct this question to Bob. So, because both of you mentioned involving engaging stakeholders in an institution, and Shan was talking about more from the strategic side. How about policy? Given that in an institution there is this power imbalance, it is quite likely that learning analytics policy may not be well received by staff and students who might not trust institutional leadership. So how can we address this issue?
Well, one of the ways I think that I tried to do when we started our unit is to focus in an area that we thought would be easiest to implement. And one of the things that was clear when we started was there was a lot of different groups on campus that were doing work around learning. And we had a group of sleep researchers who were interested in how sleep affected memory and learning performance. We had our social network analysis folks interested in looking at, do your friends make you smarter? Who do you contact with? Are you socially isolated? Does that affect how you do academics? We had economists who were very interested in looking at our learning data to see about how does that affect the jobs that they do and their success in terms of salary and other economic outcomes. We had groups that were our psychologists looking at how motivation and mindset affected learning. So these were groups that were already present at NUS and working in silos. And the learning, and I could bring them all together and they could be interested and motivated to working together because we could use the Institute as a way of combining everyone together, trying to draw multidisciplinary looks at problems, and also doing some of the work, such as putting together the data lake of our educational data. That's a lot of hard work to be able to bring together in a way that people could use it. So I think the initial strategy of really working with what we had to start with our researchers gave us a good start. And then the other areas that, in terms of helping our students learn, that was a little bit, and having our faculty, giving the information for our faculty to teach better or teach differently, that's a little bit more difficult. So we're slowly taking on those tasks. So I think Shane's comment of trying to understand what is the right problem to solve is really critical. And that helps drive all of how you build the unit and then subsequently the policies that follow it. I think in terms of the students and learning, we also don't have a problem with retention. Our students come and they finish, but I think the problem that seems to be resonating with people that the students have is that how do they stay educated beyond schools? How do they know what careers that they should be looking at, and then throughout their career work life, how do they know which classes to take to stay employed? And so we think that the school, as we're moving into lifelong education and taking responsibility for students not only during the 4 years of their undergraduate degree, but really trying to be as this country's national university, having to educate them through a career. How are they going to get advice, and how are they going to know which things that they should learn from? We think that's going to be a real need, and learning analytics can really drive that. So that's it seems to be emerging as an important problem for us to solve. And so that's this. It's trying to make sure that the learning analytics has an important problem that people can agree upon, and then everything else I think follows from that.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So it's close to the time to finish our panel, but I just see quite a few questions coming in on our course platform. And one of the questions is about the pros and cons about using student demographic data versus using data from virtual learning environments and engagement grades, etc. So I wonder if any of you would like to answer this question, or another question, which is specifically for Shane, who has mentioned that there is no need for learning analytics policy because there are existing policy frameworks already. But this question is asking whether this the existing policies do speak to the use of learning analytics for for research purposes. So feel free to take any questions.
Look, I'll tackle them both if you like. So the first one, I'd say the more information you have about a student, obviously the better the modeling you can do and around the learning behavior. So using demographic data has its purposes, but it's not really something, you know, if you find, I'll pull in a really crude, horrible, basic example. So you find that students who live outside a particular zone, so the further they travel, the more likelihood is that they will struggle to attend classes and therefore more likely to fail. You can't really uproot them, right? So it's not something that you can immediately, or if you find that, you know, a particular demographic, an age group, you know, you can't change age, you can't change those aspects. Although I did read in the guy from Norway, was it, who wanted to change his age because he felt he was younger than what he was. Nevertheless, you can't change your own demographics, so it makes it hard to put in an intervention. Though if you take the first example around distance from university, it does mean you can change your teaching approaches. So they have their place, right? So if you understand that, you know, even basic things, you know, 70% of my class are made up of international students who have never done group work before. You know, do you change the way that you would teach? That's just information. It's not, it's basics, right? It's not, I wouldn't call that learning analytics at all. So obviously then if you get into engagement data, means you can actually start to build a better profile of how the student engages and then get an understanding of aspects like self-regulated learning, which means then you can be a lot more personalized and accurate in your feedback, right? So it's far more actionable. That's learning analytics. The first part, yeah, it's just data, right? I think we often get it confused between what's learning analytics and what's just regular quality assurance or metrics. You know, are course evaluations a form of learning analytics? No, they're course evaluations, right? But you can use course evaluation data as part of your learning analytic processes. And I would say it's the same with demographics. If it resolves a particular question, yes. So the second one around, do we need a policy for the application of learning analytics specifically in ethics, in research? Well, again, we already have a process by which, and again, I can only speak from the Australian's perspective, and this will vary from country to country, right? So it may not be directly applicable, and I apologise to the person who asked that question if it's not. But in the Australian context, if we're using data full stop, right, and we're using it for quality assurance processes. So if I was looking at my course and I use student evaluation data, I could use that as a quality improvement process. In fact, it's intended to do that, right? So it doesn't mean I can't publish from it. So if I did a strategy that said, you know, I'm going to give students a lolly when they come into class and see if it has an improvement on their academic performance, the sugar rush will give them a little bit more attention during my lecture, and they'll be a happier bunch when I get my student evaluations. Lo and behold, it does. It doesn't mean I can't write up on it, and it doesn't mean I can't use that data. And do I need ethics to go through that process? Okay, you do need ethics if it's a research question and you're framing it as a research question, which then there's lots of different data sets, right, that you would look at. Learning analytics is really the process by which you're analyzing that data. So again, I would say it falls under the umbrella of a research policy per se, and how we would go through ethics, rather than it being a specific learning analytics policy for the use of student learning data. I hope that addresses the question. Bob, this is going to be far more your area, so I'll throw it over to you.
I think you answered it how I would answer it. I was just going to say that in terms of for learners, the more that the learner is willing to share the quality of the information that they get back from that data, then I think that's an individual decision. So the more that we're able to give that decision making to the learner themselves, and I think it will help with some of these privacy versus benefit types of issues that we're always dealing with. So yeah, more information is better, but more information is that the cost is more concerns about privacy, and that where that cost benefit ratio lies is, I think if we're able to give it to the individual as much as possible, that's best. And then sometimes there needs to be a decision that's made. Again, I'm not sure that's a policy, but a decision needs to be made as to where along that cost benefit ratio we want to stay with the individual question or problem that we're trying to solve.
Okay, great. Thank you so much for both of your insightful contributions. I have enjoyed this a lot, and I'm sure our audience have enjoyed this a lot too. So I would like to just give thanks to the audience as well for joining and watching this panel. I know that some of you are actually getting up very early, like 2 a.m., 3 a.m., and would like to just give thanks to all of you, and particularly to our panelists again. Thank you very much, and we'll call this the end of our first panel for the SHEILA MOOC. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Likewise.
Bye.
Bye-bye.